Everyone, I'm Allie Buchman here with the Potomac Bead Company, and I'm going to show you today the Materello bracelet. The Materello bracelet, or rolling pin in Italian, is going to be using 5 different types of beads, and it kind of looks like it has rolling pins lined up. I thought that's what these ended up looking like, so that's how I came up with the name. And we're going to be using a variety of products. To start out with, we are going to be using 8 seed beads for our base. Then we're going to be embellishing our base with some 15 drops and then 11 We're also going to be making the bracelet sparkle and shine with some Potomac crystals as well. We're going to be doing this in a tiny bit different form, and I'm going to be using the following colors. For my 8 base, I am going to be using the Silver Line Dark Transparent AB, and when I use this here, it's really going to pop and shine with that pretty reddish pinkish tones. On the top here, I'm going to be using the Black Full Chrome, or you could use a hematite bead. The Black Full Chrome is a check coating on the Miyuki 11. Then the 15 which kind of decorate just the little sides here where I've used the turquoise green. I'm going to be using the Dye Transparent Wine in a 15. And for my drop, I'm using another one that's a check coating. I'm using the Crystal Graphite in the drop. That's going to become the little fringe on the bracelet. For my crystals that are in the middle, they're going to have the hematite or the chrome here on the sides. I'm going to be using the light pewter in the Potomac Rondelles, which are 3x4mm rondelle crystal that we produce. This is all going to be put together with some wildfire beading thread in 0.006 in a green color. I'm going to be using 1 needle, so this is a single needle project, and I'm using size 10 English beading needles. I have a pliers handy so I can flatten out the thread, so that way it's become easier to actually do my threading of my needles. You also want to have handy a thread burner and some glue. I'm going to be using one of the magic blue cup buttons too in order to finish off the project, which is really going to pick up that transparent topaz AB really well. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually make the base of the bracelet, and this is made entirely of our 8 seed beads. You can see here that it kind of puckers in the middle, and that's what gives it that 3-dimensional sitting upright look. So for this, I have my 8 lined up here and poured out, and I really think that color is going to work great. That's the only thing we're going to be working with to start. I have 5 feet of beading thread and a beading needle on, and I have a stop bead, just an 11 hematite colored seed bead that I had near my bead mat. I'm going to take that down to the end of my thread, and because I do come up and down the project, I'm not going to worry about adding my clasp this first pass, so I'm going to do a stop bead. I have about 2 inches left at the base of my thread, and I'm going to take my needle through that bead, away from that little tail of thread, pull all the rest of the thread through, and that's going to expose 1 piece of thread on the outside of the bead. I'm going to do that 2 times, creating a stop bead, which will allow me to take that bead off after I'm done. And because I am using a different bead that's not included in my project, I'll know that that bead is where it comes off. So you always want to pick up a different bead for your stop bead. Once you have your stop bead on, we're going to be doing some ladder stitch. So the ladder stitch formation and then a square stitch is what we're going to do. I'm going to switch it up a little bit because I like to do that. After I make one, I like to switch the design a tiny bit. I'm not going to make my rolling pin quite as long, so I'm just going to make it a little bit shorter. That's going to allow these PC rondelles to stick out and to stand out just a little bit more. So we're going to be doing this in groups of 2, and what I'm going to do is a ladder stitch of 2. So I'm going to put on, to start, 2 of my 8 seed beads. I'm going to put on 2 more, which is going to be my second row of my ladder stitch. I'm letting all of these beads drop down to my stop bead. Oh, I've got an extra one on there. I'm getting that guy off. I'm letting them all drop down to my stop bead, so I have those 4 beads. I'm going to take my needle and thread back through all 4 beads, and that's going to go away from the stop bead. Once I have the needle through all 4, I'm pulling my thread through, And I'm going to force the beads to sit next to one another. That will also push the stop bead off to the side. So they're going to be sitting two, one on top of the other. If one kind of flares out to the side, don't worry too much about that. We're not going to worry about that for our design. So now it's easy to continue the ladder stitch. We're going to add 2 beads at a time for our ladder. We're going to sew back through the 2 beads that the thread is coming out of, and we're going to be coming towards the thread. That's going to create that loop there that the beads are hanging on. And when I pull tight, those beads sit right on top of the last ones. My thread then goes back through the 2 beads that I just added, coming out on the other side, and that's going to be how we do ladder stitch. It's the same thing basically repeated over and over and over again. What we're going to be doing a little bit different than just basic ladder stitch is, in addition to the ladder stitch, we're going to be adding some side beads here, and that's almost in a square stitch fashion. So we're going to start out by, we have our 3 rows of our ladder stitch. We're going to do a 4th row, and then we're going to kind of pick up some of the beads here on the side. So to add my 4th row, I'm going to add my 2 more beads. I'm sewing up through the beads that the thread is coming out of, so I'm sewing through the opposite way where the thread is coming out. And then I'm going to sew through the 2 that I just added. And that's going to be my last section there of my ladder stitch. What I want to add now are the beads on the side. So I'm adding these groups of beads on the side. To do that, we're going to do that in a square stitch fashion. I'm going to add 2 more beads here, and I'm going to sew through that 2nd row back. What that is going to do is force 2 more beads to kind of sit there off to the side. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, sewing through 2 more. And this time, rather sewing through the whole way to the end, I'm just going to sew through 2 more beads at the very end of my beginner ladder stitch section. What that's going to do is pop those 2 beads that I just added right off there to the side. So you can see now I have 4 beads lined up on each row. I'm going to continue now with my ladder stitch, adding 2 beads and just picking up the middle 2 beads. Add those in that same ladder stitch fashion. I want the middle here, when I'm looking at it, to have 2 empty in between each of my bar rows of my rolling pins. So I have 1 empty right here. I'm going to do 1 more ladder stitch. That's empty. So there are going to be the 2 that are in the middle. In order to add my side here, what I'm going to add my beads to, I need to do 2 more stitches, remember, and then create the sides. So I'm going to do 2 more ladder stitches. That'll be 4 in total. You can see with the ladder stitch, sometimes you're sewing away from you and sometimes you're sewing towards you. If you don't like sewing away from you or you don't like sewing towards you, whichever way is different, you can always flip your project as you're working on it. Flip it from one side to the other. I generally don't do that because I don't want to confuse you guys. Once I have my next 4 rows here of my ladder stitch, I'm going to add my 2 beads on the side of those last 2 rows, going through the 2nd row back. When I come out the other side here, I'm going to add 2 more. Sew back through the last 2 beads that were the 4th set of the ladder stitch. So this base will shrink up a little bit. You can see now that as it's starting to grow. And if you concentrate just here on those hematite color that I used in the sample piece, you can see that it does have that buckling effect. So it's going to shrink up just a tiny little bit. You're going to want to do this the whole length of your wrist. That's going to allow extra room for you to add your clasp, so that way when it does tighten up a little bit, you're not going to affect the size that much. If it does affect, we can always add on to the end if you're worried about your actual size and the clasp you're using. But right now you want to go, if you have about a 7 1/4 inch wrist, which is pretty standard, you want to make this section 7 1/4 inches. So at this point I've gotten to the end of my little ladder stitch there, and I've come out of the last ladder stitch where I have just 2 rows of 2 beads. You want to do that in between each row of 4 beads, so you're doing 2 rows of 2 and then that row of 4. So I'm coming out at the end of 2 rows of 2. I'm actually very short on thread. Usually when I do videos I do less than I tell you guys to do, so that way it stays more in frame. I do have the bracelet completed that it does touch when I get to the ends, because again we are going to shrink up a little bit. What I'm going to show you now is how to add some thread to the end of your project if you do run out. And what I have is I have taken off my size 10 needle, and I have my thread just sitting here. I'm going to tie a new piece of thread onto the old piece. To do that I'm going to bend the old piece back. I'm going to add the new piece by tying a knot around the old piece. That knot then, which is just tied around the old piece, can move up and down that old piece of thread. I'm going to pull it tight and push it down as close as I can into one of the beads. Pick up the other end of thread and tie. I'm tying a square knot right over left and then left over right, and I will come back and glue this later on. Right now I'm just going to let my thread on. You never want to glue, if you do have projects, you never want to glue in the middle of your project. You always want to glue at the very end, because you don't want to glue closed any of the holes by accident. You don't want to do that anyway, but you don't want to do that especially while you're still working on your project. What I'm going to do then is take my pliers that I have here, flatten out my thread nice and flat, and that's going to allow me to thread my needle easier. It fans out the wire, especially if you've done a thread burner and you have a burn tip on that end. And I'm going to add the thread to that needle. The needles actually have 2 sides to them, and if you turn it over, one side is easier to get into than the other. I'm going to pull back some of that thread. And keep in mind you do want to move the thread along the point, because you are creating tension when you have your needle there. So I like to move it up and down my thread so I'm not on one point of my thread too long. At this point I'm going to add my cup button clasp in that magic blue. And when I'm coming out of the last 2 beads here, whether or not you've had to add thread or not, I'm going to be adding 3 of my 11 O's in that full chrome color. I'm going to come up the seed bead, or I'm sorry, up the clasp, coming back through the back of it. When I'm here at the top, then I'm going to decorate the top with a 15-0, one of my crystals, and another 15-0. I'm going to come down the other side of my cup button, sewing back towards the project. Oh, I went through the same side there. Sew back out, and sew down the other side. Once I'm out of the back of the cup button here, what I want to do is add 3 more of my 11-0 seed beads. I'm going to sew this then down through the last 2 8-0 seed beads, and what that's going to create is that's going to create almost a round loop when you were adding your clasp. That creates just a little end in order for you to put your clasp on. We're going to reinforce that end. If you watch a lot of my videos, you know that you're always going to want to reinforce the end, because that is where you have a lot of tension. If you are adding just a regular clasp, a toggle clasp, or a lobster clasp, or some sort of tube clasp, if you are adding that, you want to use a wire protector. That's going to stop your thread from rubbing on the metal, and it sits right inside the wire protector. And we do have those in a bunch of different finishes for your project. Once I have 2 threads through my whole entire clasp end, I'm going to sew down my ladder stitch, coming out the base here, which is actually going to be near my knot of thread. And then I'm going to sew, so I'm just kind of pushing those threads off to the back. I'm going to sew down the next row of ladder stitch 2. I need to start making my rolling pins, and they're going to be here on the top. When I make the top, I'm actually making everything in one section. So I'm going to do a rolling pin section, and then a right angle weave technique to add those crystals, and then back to another rolling pin section. So I need to get my needle in place to start that. I'm going to sew back just as if I was doing more ladder stitch, sewing back down my design. When I'm coming out that 2-row ladder stitch, I'm going to pick up the 4 rows, or the row of 4, but I'm going to skip the first bead there, and I'm going to go into the bead that is right beside, that lines up with that row of 2. So I'm going to go in the second bead in my row of 4, and I'm going the whole way down through those 3 beads. When I get to the end here, I get to create my handle of my rolling pin, or my little fringe, and that's going to be in a 15-0, a drop, and a 15-0. My needle and thread then is going to sew up the 4 beads on the opposite side. So I'm coming out that first row of 4, and I'm going into and circling around the second row of 4. Once I have that, I'm going to give a tight tug. That's going to start to line up all of those seed beads. I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other side, adding a 15, a drop, and a 15. I'm going to sew down my 4 seed beads then. So you see those 4 seed beads. So I'm sewing down those 4 8-0 seed beads. When I do that, again, a nice tight pull. And when I'm coming out at the end here, and I'll just lay it down so you can see a little bit better. When I'm coming out of the end here, that is when I'm going to add my 11 O's on the top of my project. So I'm going to pick up that hematite color 11 O's, add them onto the top of the project, and that's going to help to kind of hold that all in together, and is also going to decorate to have that rolling pin effect. So I'm going to be adding my 11 O's here on the top, and I'm going to do a group of 6 11 O's. I want those to sit right on top of that rolling pin, so I'm going to let those drop down next to my beads. And where I'm going to take my needle now is basically across in a diagonal to the other side of the group of 4. So I'm coming out the first group of 4 on a corner here, right by my little fringe. I'm going to take my needle and thread to the opposite corner, which is going to be right here, this group of 4. I'm going to then come down that group of 4 so that way my beads sit right on top. And I'm going to come out right between the 3rd and the 4th bead. That's going to allow me to get to my next little section. When you pull it then, those 11 O's, you want to kind of push them down. They're going to sit right in place right above the 8 O's and just decorate the top a little bit to create that rolling pin effect. When I'm coming out those 2 beads then, so I'm coming out between the 3rd and the 4th bead of the second row of 4, a lot of numbers in this one, I'm going to add my side beads. So the side beads here are 111, 1 crystal, 111. We're going to add them and sew through 2 beads on the other side, go back around, and we're spinning around back in a right angle weave. So to do that, I want to add my crystals and my 11 O's. I'm going to sew and grab the middle 2 of the next row of 4. So my next rolling pin, I'm grabbing the first 2 and I'm sewing into those first 2. That's going to pull that concave shape and kind of get that dimensional. Again, I'm going to add my pattern, which is going to be my 11 O's, my Potomac Rondelle and 11 O's. And doing this in a right angle weave, I'm going to come back to the first grouping of, or my first rolling pin that I created, to the second row of 4. I'm going to go in between beads and catch beads 2 and 3. And once you do this first section, you'll realize, oh yeah, it's just I'm making a box basically. I want to make sure that those beads sit up to the center, so give a nice tight pull. But there you can see the start of it, that when you have it here, those beads are going to pull up just a little tiny bit. They're going to pull those 2 beads that are empty on the bottom there, just those rows of 2, they're going to pull them down a little bit here. You're going to see just a tiny bit of thread, but that doesn't matter, it's on the back. And we spun around to do that in a right angle weave. I'm then going to get to my next section here to add my next rolling pin by sewing down the 11, the crystal, and the 11. And that's the first one that I put on. And then I'm going to sew through 3 beads on my next rolling pin. So I'm going to catch the first 3 beads here, leaving that 4th bead just kind of hang out. Give a nice tight pull at the end of this. Once I'm at the end of this section here, I'm going to add my rolling pin handles, and those are a 15, a drop, and a 15. So down through the 4 beads on the other side. So this is just the same pattern repeated, but just so you guys get it. Add that 15, drop 15. When I sew back the other side, I'm going to sew the whole way down to the end. Pulling those tight, that's going to line up those beads. Then I'm going to add my 6 11-ohs in my hematite color. And I'm going to go to the opposite corner. So I'm coming out the top right hand one. I'm going to go to the bottom left. Sewing through the first 3 beads and coming out, because I'm going to get ready then to add my crystals. Nice tight pull is going to pull that in line. I almost press down too with my beads just to get that centered in there. Next I'm going to add my side crystals, which is 11, Potomac crystal 11, and I'm sewing down to the middle 2 beads in the next rolling pin. Going to add that same pattern again, picking up the middle 2 beads in the rolling pin that we just finished. So this is that right angle weave. Once I have that tight, I'm going to go back to the first grouping of my crystals that I added and sew towards the end of my project. Pull tight, making sure that those 8-ohs kind of pop to the back. I'm going to go in now and sew down beads 2 through 4 on the next rolling pin. And then I'm going to get ready to add my little fringe drops there. So I'm just going to continue with this same pattern, adding the rolling pin tops and the crystals through that right angle weave the whole length of my bracelet. So I'm here at the end of the project there, and all of those little rolling pins look great. It looks really pretty on too. I'm really excited to wear this one. So what I'm going to do is get basically to the end of my project, and I'm going to add the loop to go on the end of the cup button here. Once I'm coming out of a bead, as if I was getting ready to add my next crystal through that right angle weave, I'm going to just go down and sew down the ladder stitch. If you want to, you could decorate the ends here, but I'm not, because I don't want it to kind of conflict with my clasp closure. I'm going to the very end and I'm coming out that stop bead. I'm going to make sure that that stop bead stays out of the project, so you don't want to weave into that stop bead. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to create our loop. So I'm going to use the loop. You could do this with your 15s or your 11s. I'm going to do this with my 11-oh seed beads. And what I'm going to do is pick up 25 of these 11-oh seed beads. Once I have those picked up, I'm going to make my loop and sew. You want to add enough beads to make sure that it'll go around your cup button, but not too big that it'll fall off. Once I have them on, I'm going to sew back through the 2 8-oh beads that I'm coming out of to make that loop. I'm going to sew then back through all of those beads here, hoping I have enough thread, and I'm going to sew back through all of those beads, reinforcing the clasp. Once I'm through all of those beads, my needle is going to be coming out on this end here, and I'm simply going to tie my two thread ends together. You can see there I took my needle through the opposite direction. And because my thread is really short, what I'm actually going to do is weave it back through those 3 beads, and then I'm going to bring this thread to the opposite side and tie those together. If you want to and you have trouble going through the beads without the needle, you can also just put a little wax on the end, feed them through, or feed the starting tail back up through these beads here. I'm just going to thread through them. Thread through my project. If you need to, you can grab some pliers and pull the thread out. When I pull nice and tight then, I'm going to go back, take off my little stop bead. I'm going to take this to the opposite side of my beads. And you could put a needle on here if you want to. If you have a big eye needle sitting handy, that's actually pretty nice to have handy just for quick things like this where you just need to get a needle on. And I'm going to take it to the other side. I'm going to have to put my needle on. If you want also, you could decorate your loop up with a peyote stitch. That would look pretty. So you have your needle on, you're going to sew through the project back to where the thread ends. And once the 2 threads are together and we have that thread reinforced, I'm going to take the needle off, pull my thread nice and tight, and tie to create my loop. At the very end of my projects, I'm always going to go back, and anywhere that I had knots, which is going to be where I added, and then right here at the start and the end, I'm going to drop a dab of super glue glue. And that's going to make sure that my thread does not open up. If you are a person that doesn't like to glue, that's okay. And what you're going to do is keep your needle on at this point after you tie your knot. So back through the project a couple places and do some half hitch knots or some sewer's knots in order to sew that into place there. But once you glue, your project is actually finished. You can burn down your thread ends and finish it off. And the awesome thing is you have this 2-dimensional bracelet that you didn't really work that hard for, and it gives that nice lay and that illusion of having multi-layers without actually having to do really multi-layers. I'm going to put it on to kind of model it for you guys. And again, I really do like this one. You can make a really cute set of earrings too to match with just that rolling pin section. So hopefully you guys found this exciting. You can do a lot of variations, change up some of your beads in the middle, add different beads on the ends. You could add 15-0s in the middle, do a little peyote stitch in the middle. So really kind of play up the design. Here's the back of it. Here's the front of the wonderful design. And if you like the design like this and you like our YouTube videos, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel to get regular updates on videos as well as updates on products and just the different things that we're doing. You can also visit us at PotomacBeads.com. There you can click on the locations page to show you if you're near one of our Potomac Bead Company locations. We'd love to have you in a class or see you in the store to gather some materials. If you can't get to one of our stores, we'd be happy to ship products to you. You can go to the shop now and order online. Also in the Show More button under the description of the video, we'll have links to all the products that we used here in this video. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and enjoy having fun making the rolling pin bracelet.